The great hall of the Archive of Temporal Artifacts was finally settling. Outside the thick, time-worn stone walls, the Ministry of Magic had ceased its nightly bustle, leaving only the sound of distant, echoing footsteps, the ghosts of overtime, as the keepers called them. Elias Thorne, head keeper, breathed a sigh that carried the faint, dry scent of old parchment and cooling brass. He ran a gentle, dust-clearing charm across the massive central artifact of the room, the Hourglass Chronometer. This was the machine that governed the magical synchronization of routine across the British Isles. A towering construction of crystal, polished mahogany, and silently rotating gears. It was magnificent, designed not to measure time, but to calm it. Seraphina Vale, his apprentice, was busy banking the magical fires in the hearth, her own breathing slow and regulated by the chronometer's majestic rhythm. "Another day archived, Seraphina," Elias murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "Notice the sound tonight, perfectly weighted, that deep, slow tick-tock. It's a lullaby for the very concept of past and future." Seraphina nodded, feeling the ancient, soporific quality of the archive's magic settling over her, heavy and protective. This quiet routine was their anchor, a testament to the fact that the greatest magic often happens in silence, not in noise. It was the hour when the world ceased its desperate rush, and even the shadows seemed to fall asleep. Elias paused, his fingers resting lightly on the chronometer's brass base. His brow furrowed. The air, which moments ago had been thick with calming magic, now held a subtle, nearly imperceptible discord. It wasn't a mechanical failure. There was no grinding of gears or physical break. "Listen, child," Elias instructed, his voice low and intensely focused. Seraphina immediately stilled her movements, turning her full attention to the great clock. The deep tick-tock was still there, but under it, like a tiny, erratic heartbeat, was a wrong vibration. It was a magical dissonance, a feeling of panic in the mechanism's deep magical core. It was anxious, struggling to hold its perfect, unhurried pace. It was, impossibly, having a magical fever. "The hourglass is afraid," Seraphina whispered, recognizing the unfamiliar texture of the energy. "It is not fear, not as we know it," Elias corrected, pulling his hand away with reluctance. "It is forgetting. The hourglass keeps the rhythm of the archive, and a vital rhythm is slipping from its grasp. If it panics, the archive panics. We must find what it is trying to remember, and we must do so before the rising anxiety shatters the tranquility of 100 years." The diagnosis was clear. The hourglass needed quiet treatment, not aggressive repair. Elias pulled 2 small, worn velvet cushions from a drawer and placed them carefully beneath the chronometer's base, dampening its immediate vibrations. "Your wand, Seraphina," Elias said, his voice calm despite the urgency. "Hold it horizontally, like a seismograph. Focus your senses not on the surface of the wood, but on the pitch and depth of the magic within it. Ignore the noise of the chronometer, the sound of its enormous body working, and listen for the hum of its consciousness." Seraphina struggled. Her magic was reactive, designed for doing. To force it to be still and purely receptive was immensely challenging. The chaotic vibration of the chronometer made her wand jump in her hand like a nervous insect. "You are trying to command the magic," Elias observed gently. "You must let the hourglass speak through the wand. Be still. Your wand is the ear of your heart. It will not lie, but it only whispers the truth." Slowly, Seraphina surrendered her focus. She let the wand relax. The frantic jitters subsided, and suddenly the internal hum of the hourglass came through clear and distinct. It was a rising, high-pitched whine of pure, desperate anxiety. It wasn't broken. It was deeply unsettled. Knowing the hourglass was anxious allowed them to shift from mechanical repair to magical therapy. They needed a spell to soothe the great beast of the archive. Elias led Seraphina into the restricted section of temporal charms. Hours passed in the dusty, quiet aisles. They were looking for something ancient, something that spoke of patience rather than speed. Finally, in a heavy, leather-bound volume titled Rituals of the Unhurried, Elias found what he was looking for. A forgotten, complex piece of counter-magic known as the lulling spell. Pax Eterna, Tempus Quietum. The text described it as a charm used by the earliest timekeepers, those who worked before the invention of chronometers to quiet magical imbalances in their local environment. It was designed not to stop time, but to calm the magic of time itself, enforcing a profound, stable tranquility. "This is it," Elias sighed, tracing the unfamiliar runes. "This is the lullaby the hourglass needs. But look, Seraphina. The inscription specifies a conduit. The charm must be cast through a vessel of memory." The lulling spell required more than a wand. It needed an object imbued with a profound, unhurried, personal moment of peace, a physical anchor for perfect, stable tranquility. The discovery of the lulling spell presented a new, immediate puzzle. The required vessel of memory was the true magical component. "It cannot be just any artifact," Elias explained, gently shutting the heavy book. "The spell doesn't draw power. It draws state. The vessel must contain a memory so profound, so settled, that it can act as an absolute counterpoint to the hourglass's current anxiety." Seraphina suggested several powerful artifacts: a self-stirring cauldron from Hogwarts, a quill that recorded the history of the archive. Elias shook his head to each. "Too much doing," he murmured. "The cauldron is productive, the quill inquisitive. We need something that embodies being, an object that holds a moment where the world stopped for the holder, not because of fear, but because of perfect, unburdened peace." Elias stood up, his gaze distant, looking past the crystal chandeliers and into his own past. He realized that the memory and the vessel had to come from him. His magic was the only one old enough, quiet enough, to contain the necessary counterbalance. Elias led Seraphina back to his small, quiet study, where a handful of personal, non-archive artifacts resided. He opened a simple, uncharmed wooden box. Inside, resting on faded blue silk, was a small, heavy brass-cased pocket watch. Its face was tarnished. The hands stopped exactly at 11:37. "My mother gave me this when I left for Hogwarts," Elias recalled, his voice soft with distant emotion. It was a common Muggle-made item, but when I took my first true quiet post here in the archive, it was the first thing I unpacked. The time on its face. 11:37 is the exact moment I finally accepted the deep silence of this place. I was young, ambitious, and utterly alone, yet the silence was the profoundest peace I had ever known. He lifted the pocket watch. The moment was not about the watch itself, but the stillness it witnessed. He hadn't stopped the hands. The overwhelming magical silence of the archive had simply caused the Muggle mechanism to cease functioning, forever locking in that moment of perfect peace. This object was the memory. "This is the vessel of memory," Elias stated, placing the watch in Seraphina's hands. "Now, the ritual is simple but absolute. I must immerse myself entirely in the memory held within this watch. And you, Seraphina, must cast the protective and lulling charms, using the watch as the anchor. You must not merely remember the peace of 11:37, you must become it." The clock was not merely ticking louder, it was beginning to distort the time in the hall. Dust motes hung too long in the air. Seraphina felt her spells take an extra heartbeat to manifest. The anxiety of the hourglass was becoming a genuine threat. They returned to the chronometer. Elias took his position, holding the pocket watch tightly against his chest, right over his heart. He began the initial part of the ritual, a deep, meditative state, pushing aside the immediate chaos to reach the stillness held within the brass case. He needed to surrender his consciousness to the single, perfect memory of 11:37. Seraphina, meanwhile, cast a complex series of silencing and dampening charms, encircling Elias in a protective, neutral bubble. Her task was to keep the outer chaos of the hourglass from breaking his inner focus. She worked methodically, her breathing slow and even, forcing her own magical urgency into a pattern of perfect, quiet competence. As Elias's eyes glazed over, his magic turning inward to meet the memory, the hourglass reacted. It felt the counter-magic approaching, and it fought back. The counter-attack was not a physical blast, but a terrifying sonic bloom of temporal feedback. The mechanism screamed a high, tearing note that cut through Seraphina's dampening charms. The sound was meant to shatter their concentration, a magical white noise that felt like time itself was being shredded. Crystal fittings on the chronometer's casing rattled violently, throwing off sharp, blinding bursts of refracted light. Seraphina staggered, momentarily disoriented, the sound threatening to fracture her will. "Focus, Seraphina!" Elias's voice, though coming from a deep, internal place, cut through the noise. "The stillness. Remember the stillness." She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain in her ears. Her reactive, powerful magic was useless against this sonic chaos. She needed the quiet discipline Elias had taught her. She forced herself to breathe, recalling the absolute peace she had experienced when they first found the lulling spell. With a desperate surge of controlled will, she performed a difficult, non-verbal Aegis charm. A complex web of protection designed not to block the noise, but to separate the space inside her shield from the time outside it. It was a momentary bubble of pure, stable now. The sonic blast hit the Aegis charm and dissipated, like a wave hitting a perfectly smooth stone. Elias remained secure in his trance, the memory safe. Seraphina, exhausted, held the shield steady, watching Elias's lips barely move as he began the verbal component of the lulling charm's prelude, his voice too quiet to hear. Inside the pocket watch's memory, Elias's consciousness was not simply reliving the quiet moment. Instead, he found himself deep within the magical core of the chronometer, perceiving its internal, vast landscape. It was a beautiful, terrifying place, a labyrinth of spinning copper threads, crystal pathways, and silently whirring temporal energies. But the labyrinth was collapsing. He saw the chronometer's mind, a consciousness of pure, structured rhythm, in a state of growing panic. It wasn't anxious about the future. It was terrified of the missing piece. Elias was shown a brief, searing vision of a small, vital component. The hourglass was looking for a tiny silver object that had always been part of its existence, a piece of magic it relied on for its foundational beat. He saw the object clearly, a simple, unadorned silver sphere, no larger than a snitch, surrounded by the scent of lavender. It was the pace keeper, the stabilizing component of the entire mechanism, removed and forgotten decades ago. The hourglass, aging and vast, had finally noticed its absence, and in its attempt to self-correct, was trying to create time without a rhythm, leading to the chaotic dissonance. It was trying to remember its own heart. Elias was jolted back into the hall, the Aegis charm trembling around them. His own memory was depleted, his mind reeling from the scale of the hourglass's panic. "It's not broken, Seraphina," Elias gasped, leaning heavily on the brass casing. "It has forgotten its pacekeeper, a small silver sphere, surrounded by the scent of old lavender and brass." "The pacekeeper?" Seraphina frowned. "That's not in any diagram. Why would it be removed?" "A past keeper, perhaps, who wanted a minute of perfect time for himself, then simply forgot to put it back. The hourglass only noticed its rhythm was missing now. It must be inside the archive. The scent, the lavender is so faint, but constant." Elias stood up, forcing his tired body into action. He was a master of unimportant magic, the tiny, overlooked things. He cast a highly sensitive tracking charm, focusing on the combination of brass, lavender, and the faint magical echo of rhythm. The charm didn't point toward the main vaults or the library. It pointed down toward the low-ceilinged, dirt floor access beneath the archive's main structure, the place where decades of defunct, unclassified, and utterly forgotten magical objects were stored, the sub-level of lost intentions. The sub-level of lost intentions was not protected by complex locks or wards. It was protected by sheer apathy. The atmosphere was thick with the magical residue of neglect spells that fizzled out, potions that had evaporated to a sticky sludge, and countless forgotten projects. The oppressive sense of it doesn't matter was more difficult to fight than any curse. Their own vibrant, focused magic felt sluggish and slow. The low ceiling, dusty shelves that reached into the gloom, and endless aisles created a labyrinth of failure and forgotten dreams. Elias and Seraphina moved through the oppressive quiet, their wands casting only the most minimal light, their steps hushed. The frantic pulse of the chronometer was muffled here, replaced by an unnerving, heavy, dead silence. "The magic here is asleep, Seraphina," Elias whispered, his voice catching the dust. "It doesn't resist us. It simply ignores us. Our search charm relies on the Pacekeeper's latent magic. But this place is a vacuum of magical interest." They abandoned the tracking charm. Elias returned to the basic art of listening. He instructed Seraphina to use her magic to listen not for the Pacekeeper's scent, but for a lack of apathy, a single item in this vast grave of intention that still held a core of intentional stillness. The search was becoming desperate. The hourglass's frantic pulse, though muffled by the sheer apathy of the sublevel, was growing stronger, vibrating through the cold stone floor. The ghost scent of lavender would flicker into clarity, then dissolve into the prevailing odors of dust and decay. Seraphina, obeying her own logic, knelt, casting her Lumos Solemnis beam beneath the bottom shelf, where truly small and meaningless items often rolled to escape notice. "Elias," she called out softly, her voice filled with sudden certainty. "Forget the scent. Focus on the stillness. I think I see something that doesn't belong to the noise." Wedged between the base of the shelf and the stone floor, concealed behind a crumbling wooden crate of ancient ministry forms, was a shallow, plain object. There, nestled in a profound pocket of darkness, was the Pacekeeper. It was a small, brass-hinged case, no larger than a snitch, tarnished dark with age but retaining a faint, dull luster. A distinct, dry scent of lavender, stronger here than anywhere else, wafted up from the surrounding dust. Elias knelt beside her. The object's magic wasn't loud, but its silence was intentional. This was an object that had been put to sleep, not simply abandoned. He gently lifted the brass case. Inside, nested in a thin, worn purple velvet lining that still held the ghost of lavender, lay the true artifact. A tiny, unadorned silver sphere, perfectly motionless. This silver sphere was the Pacekeeper. Its sole magic was to hold a single, tiny, forgotten moment of perfect peace. "We have it," Elias breathed, securing the case inside his robes. "But we must hurry, Seraphina. The hourglass is fully awake now. It will try to pull us back, or worse, try to claim the Pacekeeper prematurely. We need to perform the full lulling spell as intended, or the clock will break itself trying to reset." They burst out of the sub-level access and into the main archive. The Hourglass Hall, usually a haven of quiet contemplation, was in open revolt. The hourglass itself was screaming. The giant glass pendulum was swinging wildly, throwing off shimmering, jagged edges of temporal energy. The sand within the upper chamber was moving too fast, not falling, but boiling upward in defiance of gravity, each grain a tiny shard of magical static. "The chronometer is rejecting the Pacekeeper's absence. We must hurry," Elias yelled over the chaotic roar. Seraphina immediately deployed a massive shield charm, Protego Maxima, to dampen the sonic and temporal chaos that threatened to disorient them. Elias moved toward the base of the chronometer, where there was a faint, shallow indentation the size of the pacekeeper case. "Seraphina! The spell now! The environment must be calm, or the conflicting energies will destroy the case," Elias instructed. Seraphina centered herself, forcing her will to be perfectly tranquil, ignoring the chaos. She inhaled slowly, and then, with profound focus, spoke the final forgotten words of the ritual. "Pax Eterna, tempus quietum, revertimini ad sedem." Eternal peace, quiet time. Return to your seat. The chaotic shimmer of the temporal energy dulled. The screeching whine dropped an octave, and the physical forces seemed to hesitate. Elias seized the moment. He fit the brass case into the indentation at the base of the chronometer. It clicked into place with a subtle, yet massive, magical thud. As the pacekeeper settled, a single, clear, musical note chimed from deep within the mechanism. The hourglass was accepting its memory. But the hourglass was still awake. Elias placed both hands on the cool brass of the case, focusing his entire being on the single, perfect, unhurried moment held within the silver sphere. The final act of the ritual was not a spell, but a transfer of calm. He closed his eyes, ready to surrender his own inner quiet to the hourglass's vast, wounded mind. Elias had his hands fixed on the small brass case, his entire consciousness flowing through the silver sphere and into the wounded, vast mind of the chronometer. It was not a violent push of power, but a gentle, steady surrender. He offered the hourglass the sum of his own decades of quiet study, his measured breathing, and the profound, unhurried stillness he had learned from his own deep-set memories. The chronometer accepted the gift like a tired giant finally finding its comfortable bed. Seraphina watched, breathless, as the raging chaos surrounding the hourglass began its slow, inevitable retreat. The abrasive whine dropped entirely, replaced by a deep, resonant hum. The sound of gears meshing with perfect, satisfying precision. The turbulent, fast-boiling sand within the upper chamber stopped its ascent. For a single, suspended moment, the grains hung in the air, motionless, shimmering like countless tiny diamonds of light. Then, with an almost audible sigh of relief, the sand began to fall again. Not frantic, but slow, steady, and inevitable, moving with the rhythmic elegance of natural time. The giant pendulum, which had been swinging like a frantic metronome, completed one final chaotic arc, and then began to dampen. It dampened and dampened until it was moving with a mesmerizing, soporific rhythm. The gentle, heavy beat of a heart returning to slumber. Tick, tock, regular, certain, and profoundly calming. Elias slumped slightly, his task complete, the transfer successful. The hourglass was synchronized, the lost memory recovered, and perfectly integrated into its routine. The archive, from its deepest sublevels to its highest crystal dome, breathed out a collective, magical sigh of perfect stillness. He opened his eyes, now dark and heavy with exhaustion. Seraphina rushed to his side, letting the Protego Maxima finally dissolve into the restored silence. The air was no longer sharp with ozone, but clean, carrying the faint, reassuring scent of aged paper and quiet magic. "It is done," Elias murmured, leaning against the cool brass. "The pacekeeper is back in its resting place. It only needed to remember the importance of that one perfect, quiet minute." They stood for a long time, watching the majestic, enormous mechanism now moving with flawless grace. The light in the hall softened, bathing the polished wood in a warm, sleepy glow. Slowly, they made their way back up the stairs and across the courtyard to the keeper's cottage. Elias sat by the hearth, watching the embers glow, too spent for speech. Seraphina brought him a steaming mug of chamomile tea, sweetened with moon-dew honey, a gentle, soothing draught against magical exhaustion. The events of the night, the desperate search, the chaotic magic, the terrifying stillness of the sub-level already seemed distant, dissolving into the safety of the cottage walls. The archive was settled. The time was quiet. The world outside could wait for the morning. Elias lifted the mug to his lips, watching the flames. He gave Seraphina a slow, peaceful smile. "Tomorrow, child," he whispered, his voice warm with profound contentment. "Tomorrow we rest, and we listen to the quiet." As Seraphina settled into her own chair, the rhythmic, steady tick-tock of the now perfectly healed Hourglass Hall filtered faintly through the thick stone walls. A massive, magnificent lullaby, guaranteeing that for now all was safe, all was remembered, and all was exactly as it should be.